Hey there, welcome to a world where cherry blossoms drift on the wind, but every petal lands with the weight of a commandment. Tonight, I'm taking you straight into the heart of feudal Japan, a place where beauty and brutality are so tightly woven that sometimes you can't tell which is which until it's too late. Before we get lost among the shadows and rituals, I promise there's a twist you won't see coming. Something about the lowest rungs of society that will make you question everything you thought you knew about honor and shame. If you actually enjoy these honest, slightly unhinged deep dives into weird history, go ahead and tap like or subscribe, but only if you mean it. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing the global midnight roll call. There's something magical about the idea that right now, somewhere in the world, someone's winding down with a little bit of history. So, dim the lights, get comfy. Maybe flip on that fan for some background white noise, and let's unravel the elegant, suffocating order of feudal Japan together. Let's set the stage. You don't wake up in feudal Japan and think, what will I become today? That's adorable. Your fate was decided before you even drew your first breath, carved into your family line by ancestors who have been dead so long, their names are basically punchlines at this point. Your lot in life isn't a suggestion. It's a hereditary life sentence. Gift wrapped in silk or mud, depending on which lottery you lost. Suppose you're born into a samurai clan. Congratulations, you're now the proud inheritor of a sword, a code of honor, and a list of etiquette rules so long you'll need a scroll to remember them. The blade is your birthright, but so is the constant anxiety that comes with it. There are 10,000 ways to sit, kneel, bow, and breathe in front of your lord. Pick the wrong one, and you might find yourself at the sharp end of a teachable moment. If you thought being a middle manager was stressful, imagine living every day knowing your supervisor carries a katana. Or perhaps you're a peasant. Let me be the first to say my condolences. Your legacy is 40 years of wading through muddy rice paddies, your children destined to follow in your soggy footsteps, and there's no ladder to climb. There's no pull yourself up by your straw sandals speech coming. There's no resume, no pivot to take, and definitely no start your own business. You're a peasant because your parents were peasants, and their parents were peasants, and so on, all the way back to the first person who figured out what rice even was. That's your destiny, set in stone and ankle-deep in water. The hierarchy is brutal in its simplicity. 4 classes, 4 costumes, and absolutely no substitutions allowed. You're either samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant. And that's it. You don't get to trade badges. You don't even get to ask. Trying to move up the social ladder, that's not just discouraged. It's a criminal offense. You don't climb. You kneel. Then there's the Eta, the so-called untouchables. They're the ones who handle death, butchers, tanners, executioners, leatherworkers. Society desperately needs them, but prefers to act like they're invisible. Picture ghosts with jobs. They have critical roles, but everyone pretends they're not really there. If you ever wondered what it would be like to be essential and yet erased at the same time, congratulations, you found it. And just when you think you've got a handle on things, the system throws you another curveball. Maybe you think being a merchant sounds pretty swell. money, trade, the thrill of a good haggle. But in feudal Japan, merchants are parked near the bottom of the heap. Why? Because you make money off other people's work, and that's morally suspicious. In a world where hard labor is worshipped, being efficient is actually a character flaw. Your coin jingles, but nobody's impressed. Peasants, meanwhile, are squeezed like a rice press. Your taxes are extracted in the very rice you grow, and if you surrender too much, your family starves. But try to hide a little extra to survive, and suddenly you're committing high treason. Heads roll, sometimes literally, just for trying to keep dinner on the table. As a samurai, you've got honor, sure, but you also live in a permanent state of panic. Your lord, your ancestors, your tailor, even your sword, they're all watching for the tiniest slip-up. A misplaced sneeze could cost you your dignity, maybe more. You're not just fighting on the battlefield, you're fighting for social survival every minute of the day. And if you're a woman, don't think you're going to slip through the cracks. Your options begin and end with your father's opinion. You marry the person chosen for you, follow every command. And if you're lucky, you might be permitted to learn a little poetry. Freedom is a rumor you'll never get to verify. So here you are, assigned a costume and a script, shoved onto society's stage, whether you want to perform or not. It's elegant, yes, sometimes even breathtakingly poetic, and at the same time, it's utterly inescapable. You're trapped before you've even had your morning tea. Now, if you're picturing a world of endless dirt and hardship, you're only half right. Feudal Japan was obsessed with cleanliness to a degree that makes modern hygiene influencers look lazy. Cleanliness wasn't just about looking good. It was a spiritual duty, a ritual that bordered on the religious. Sounds nice until you're facing a basin of water in January. Your day begins with washing, but not in a cozy tiled bathroom with a heated towel rack. You're at a stone basin, hands numb in water so cold it could double as punishment. No hot water, no negotiation. You splash your face and arms, shivering as if your ancestors are watching and silently judging your pain threshold. Soap. Only if you're wealthy. And even then, it's either ash or rice bran, with a scent that could charitably be called monastic challenge. If you're lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, that's where the real fun begins. The bathhouse is the social hub, but forget privacy. Everyone from your neighbor to your landlord to your future in-laws is right there with you, stripped down and pretending this isn't the most awkward group activity since middle school gym class. You scrub before you soak, because dirtying the bath water isn't just rude, it's social suicide. If you're nowhere near a bathhouse, you make do with what you have, when you have it. You clean your teeth with salt or a twig. You air out your clothes. You clip your nails. You don't do these things to impress anyone, but because society sees dirt as a kind of spiritual corruption. Now, if you're samurai, double the anxiety. Your lord could decide to inspect you at any moment, and if he finds dirty fingernails or a wrinkled robe, you're risking dishonor and possibly unemployment, the permanent kind. Too much body odor during a bow? Well, let's just say you might not be bowing again. Women, you're under even more scrutiny. You're expected to smell like cherry blossoms and self-discipline. Bathing is practically a military operation, precise, ritualized, and exhausting. Hair is styled into elaborate shapes that take hours to perfect, and all of this so you can look put together while pounding rice or carrying water. So yes, feudal Japan was clean, astonishingly clean, but it wasn't a spa day. The price of purity was icy water, endless grooming, and the constant, soul-shrinking suspicion that someone, somewhere, was judging your foot hygiene. And that's just the start, because whether you're a samurai, a peasant, or somewhere in between, the real challenge begins when you step outside your door and into the ceaseless ritual of the day. Next, we'll dive deeper into what it actually means to live as a samurai, the discipline, the hardship, the reality behind the legend. Picture this. You're born into the samurai class. Congratulations. Your childhood dreams of samurai glory, swords flashing in the sunlight, silk robes rippling, cherry blossoms drifting past your stoic profile, are about to meet the real job description. Let's just say the onboarding process for feudal Japan's warrior elite is less epic anime intro and more perpetual job interview where the stakes are your internal organs. You don't live for yourself. You live for your daimyo, your feudal lord, whose whims are basically the weather report for your life. If he's in a bad mood, you'd better pray for rain, because nothing washes away dishonor except, well, you know, the kind of personal atonement that comes with a short blade and a lot of ceremony. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is your operating system. It's not just a code, it's a lifelong exam you're never allowed to finish. Every action, every word, every twitch of your eyebrow is measured against a standard so strict it makes modern job performance reviews look like motivational posters. Mistakes. Those aren't learning opportunities. They're career ending. And by career ending, I mean life ending. Disobey your lord? Dishonor. Fail at your duties? Dishonor. Raise your voice, laugh too loudly, or make the mistake of glancing the wrong way during a tea ceremony. That's right, dishonor. And here's the fun part. Dishonor isn't something you walk off with a sheepish apology. It's something you're expected to fix with ritual suicide. Yes, the infamous seppuku. Kneel on a tatami mat, unsheath your short blade, and say farewell to your insides. It's not a figure of speech. It's the HR solution to underperformance. And before you ask, yes, this was normal. People didn't just accept it. They celebrated it. The path to dignity was paved with guts, literally. Mess up badly enough, and your lord's reward might be a quiet room and a gentle, you know what to do. No performance bonus, just a sharp exit interview. But let's not forget the daily grind. Being a samurai isn't just about the looming threat of poetic disembowelment. It's about relentless training. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, military tactics, calligraphy, poetry. Your calendar is full, and there is no personal day. Your posture has to be perfect, your face impassive, your sword so spotless it could double as a mirror for your doomed reflection. Show fear, shameful. Show too much emotion, embarrassing. Laugh at the wrong joke? Hope you enjoy existential dread as an after-dinner treat. Your clothing is precise down to the last fold. Your sword, your pride. must gleam. If you ever draw it in anger without cause, insult someone of higher rank, or lose a duel, you don't just lose face, you lose everything. People remember. Your ancestors feel it in the afterlife. Samurai glory? More like a daily exercise in anxiety management, with extra steps. So yes, you look fantastic in armor, but you're one poorly timed facial expression away from an invitation to your own farewell party. The samurai code doesn't just demand discipline. It demands absolute soul-crushing perfection. Blink wrong, and your legacy is toast. But maybe you're thinking, fine, I'll just be a peasant. No swords, no poetry, no risk of dramatic ritual disembowelment. Easy. Well, let's talk about your new life. You're not exactly free. You're just free of any chance for upward mobility, personal comfort, or an undisturbed night's sleep. Welcome to the rice-based underworld. You wake with the sun, not because you're spiritually connected to nature, but because you're a cog in the rice tax machine. Your hut is a masterpiece of rustic inconvenience. No windows, no doors, and a goat you didn't invite just wandered across your sleeping mat, possibly judging your life choices. Breakfast? If fortune smiles, you get a bowl of rice porridge and a generous portion of last week's pickled vegetable. If fortune frowns, your meal is a mug of river water, and the hope that hunger is mostly psychological. Then it's off to the rice paddies. Travel documentaries will show you shimmering green fields and peaceful farmers. Reality is 12 hours of mud, mosquitoes, and the distant terror that today's the day bandits show up for their withdrawal. You plant, you weed, you sweat, you pray the harvest is good, and that your lord's nephew doesn't accidentally trample your field during mounted archery practice. When the sun sets, you limp home, exhausted, only to discover the village headman wants to chat about your suspiciously low grain delivery. Maybe one of your oxen is missing. Maybe the math just doesn't work out. Either way, it's your problem. Let's talk about taxes. You don't pay in coins, you pay in rice. The government wants their share, and by share, I mean most of it. What's left goes to feeding your family, assuming the weather, insects, or random military drills haven't already ruined your crop. Did you think about complaining? That's adorable. If you speak out of turn, you risk a beating, exile, or the eternal promotion to deceased. There's no HR department, just the village headman's stick and a very creative sense of consequence. Maybe you dream of becoming a village elder. Sure, people will ask for your advice. They'll also ignore it. Your wisdom is mostly ceremonial, like the village scarecrow that everyone pretends works, but nobody respects. You're also not allowed to leave your village without written permission. That's right. You're a prisoner with a rice-based ankle bracelet and an annual case of trench foot. Festivals do exist. They give you a brief chance to get drunk on the local seg, dance badly in a circle, and try not to think about how planting season starts again in less than a week. Don't get too attached to joy. It's strictly seasonal. So, let's recap. You are the backbone of the economy. You feed everyone above you on the social ladder, and they thank you by forgetting you exist. Days off? That's a myth. Feudal Japan is built on the principles of endless toil, inherited suffering, and keeping your dreams extremely, painfully small. And you're always hungry. Of course you are. You've been working since sunrise, and your reward is not dying. time for a meal. But don't get too excited. In feudal Japan, eating isn't about pleasure. It's about survival, humility, and making sure you don't embarrass yourself by choking on a fish bone at the wrong moment. If you're a peasant, your menu is rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, rice for dinner. Sometimes it's actual rice. Sometimes it's barley in a clever disguise. A turnip or two, if the spirits are generous. Maybe a pickled radish, if fate is in a whimsical mood. Meat? That's for the daimyo, or for the chicken that mysteriously vanished after giving you a dirty look. Fish is technically on the table, dried, salted, and so sharp you could use it to sharpen your tools. Soup, usually something that calls itself miso, but is really hot water, a lot of salt, and 2 leaves floating for dramatic effect. Is it flavorful? In the same way drinking seawater is hydrating. Sure, it's an experience. Samurai fare is technically better, but don't imagine lavish banquets. You eat after your lord, his guests, and anyone else he wants to impress. That means your rice is cold, your soup is colder, and you get the spiritual nourishment of watching others eat while you look deeply honored to wait. Seasons matter, not because it's trendy, but because there's no way to preserve food. If you can't harvest it, you don't get to eat it. Winter is nature's way of suggesting you get familiar with fasting. Food poisoning? Medical care is more of a suggestion than a solution. The local remedy is to lie down, think about your ancestors, and hope you recover. If not, congratulations, you're about to meet them. Steal food, and you don't get a gentle slap on the wrist. You get a public demonstration of what happens to people who can't keep their hands off the Lord's daikon. It's not an honor. And then there's tea. You've seen the movies. The tea ceremony is less about flavor and more about perfecting your posture, reciting etiquette, and practicing existential humility. It's not about quenching thirst. It's about surviving another opportunity for social disaster. So yes, meals are sacred, quiet, and respectful. But mainly, they're small, bland, and likely to contain at least one crunchy thing you don't want to talk about. And complaining? Don't even think about it. In feudal Japan, voicing your displeasure is a fast track to finding out if rice can be served through your nose. So, now that you've finished scraping the last grains from your bowl, let's talk about the next set of hurdles. What you wear, who you love, and how you prepare for the fact that mortality is always waiting just outside your thatched hut. You've just polished off your modest bowl of crunchy maybe. Fish soup, chewing carefully in the hope that what you just swallowed was neither poisonous nor someone's pet. The room hums with low conversation, and suddenly someone says something absolutely absurd. Maybe your lord shares a haiku so dreadful it physically pains you. Maybe the village elder recounts a tale that makes about as much sense as a weather forecast from a cow. Maybe your neighbor, who is certain his ox can predict the seasons, decides to share this insight for the 100th time. And in that dangerous, fleeting moment, you consider correcting them. You imagine yourself, the voice of reason, gently pointing out that no, cows are not meteorologists, and yes, that haiku was an affront to poetry. Don't do it. In feudal Japan, your opinion is basically a liability with a side of potential decapitation. The concept of free speech, as you know it, is about as real as a sushi burrito. Here, every word you utter is a loaded weapon, and you're more likely to shoot yourself in the foot than win any argument. Speak above your station, and suddenly you're presumptuous. Criticize someone in the social stratosphere above you, and you're insolent. Crack a joke that lands flat? That's basically flirting with treason. Even within your own family, every conversation is a minefield. A son doesn't interrupt his father unless he's actively seeking exile. A wife does not correct her husband, not unless she's feeling especially lucky or has a death wish. And questioning a daimyo, that's a one-way ticket to exploring the afterlife, courtesy of a conveniently available sword. Samurai are expected to speak with the restraint of a monk, even when inwardly vibrating with rage. A sharp tongue is considered more dangerous than a dull blade. To be blunt, if you force someone to defend their honor, you might just end up as a cautionary tale for future generations. Which brings us to the art of apologies, a local pastime perfected over centuries. Here, you don't just mutter, "sorry," and move on. You bow, you grovel. You might even compose a poem about your shame, or send a symbolic gift like a live bird or an ornamental comb, all the while praying the recipient doesn't decide to jewel you anyway. And if your tone is too casual, a single misplaced word can be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or spiritual rot. Silence is almost always the safer bet. Even humor is a high-wire act. Laugh at the wrong thing and you're disrespectful. Laugh with someone important, and suddenly you're signaling that you consider yourself their equal. That's a quick way to be reassigned to some snowy outpost where the only entertainment is watching icicles grow. So yes, technically you're allowed to speak. But in practice, you nod, you smile, and you hope your opinions never escape your lips. Because in feudal Japan, loose lips don't just sink ships, they sink reputations, social standing, and, on a bad day, your entire family line. One slip, and you're starring in your own episode of How I Ruined My Bloodline without saying a word. Now, let's talk about fashion. Since you're probably picturing yourself strutting around in elaborate kimono, expressing your unique sense of style, that's adorable. In feudal Japan, fashion isn't about personal expression. It's about making sure everyone knows exactly where you stand, or rather how far below them you are, just by glancing at your sleeves. Your clothing doesn't say, "This is who I am." It says, "This is where I belong. Please don't stab me." Start at the top. Samurai glide around in layers of silk robes, sometimes armored, always dignified, arranged so meticulously you'd think they were preparing for a royal photo shoot. The colors are deep and deliberate. Indigo blues, earthy browns, and the occasional slash of blood red, a not-so-subtle reminder that this is someone who has probably killed for less than a fashion misstep. And of course, the daisho, the paired swords, are the ultimate accessory. More than weapons, they're a walking badge of authority. Drawing one in public is a last resort. Wearing them incorrectly is a first step toward being publicly corrected with extreme sharpness. Peasants, on the other hand, dress in humble cotton and an even humbler demeanor. Picture lots of brown, grey, beige, basically every color you'd find in a rice field after the rain. Not because they're minimalists, but because dyed fabric is expensive and you got bigger problems than color coordination, like surviving. Your outfit says, "Yes, I work in mud." No, these aren't my only sandals. They're my only shoes, period. Merchants occupy a strange middle ground. They may have money, but they're still ranked below both samurai and peasants. Their solution? Dress rich, but not too rich. Silk, yes, but keep it muted. They've perfected the art of looking respectable enough to do business, but not so flashy that a bored samurai decides to confiscate their wardrobe out of sheer annoyance. Artisans and craftsmen wear clothing that's neat, practical, and above all, unobtrusive. Drawing attention to yourself is considered a personality defect, and if you're lucky, the worst that happens is you get gossiped about at the bathhouse. And then there are women, tasked with the impossibly delicate balancing act of grace, obedience, and wearing approximately 12 layers of symbolism. Hairstyles are coded messages, kimono patterns are seasonal, and colors can be more treacherous than a river crossing in spring. Wear a color reserved for a different festival, and you've just dishonored your entire household and set off a neighborhood whisper campaign that will outlast the actual event. In short, what you wear isn't about comfort or style. It's about surviving the relentless daily judgment from both your ancestors and your mother-in-law. All right, let's address the cherry blossom in the room. Maybe you're imagining moonlit strolls beneath gently falling petals, whispered poetry under paper lanterns, and dramatic, forbidden romance between a samurai and a high-born princess. That's sweet. In reality, love in feudal Japan is a side quest, and it's one you're almost guaranteed to fail. Marriage isn't about feelings. It's about alliances, rice taxes, and making sure your ancestors don't collectively roll in their graves. If you're a peasant, your marriage is arranged by your parents, possibly with input from the village elder, whose matchmaking skills are only slightly more reliable than his weather predictions. Romantic compatibility is never part of the conversation. What matters is sturdy legs and healthy teeth, traits that are apparently more important than a sparkling personality. For samurai families, the stakes are even higher. Marriages are chess pieces in a political game. Your partner is chosen to secure a clan alliance, acquire land, or pay off a grudge with a particularly nice kimono. The goal isn't happiness, it's stability. Ideally, the kind that doesn't collapse during harvest season or under the weight of family grudges. Love letters do exist, but only if they're written in perfect calligraphy, decorated with the right seasonal metaphors, and delivered with the stealth of a ninja by a maid who knows entirely too much about everyone's business. Women, as usual, have even less say. A daughter of the samurai might be married off at 15, expected to master calligraphy, etiquette, needlework, and the subtle art of never letting anyone see her disappointment. Her job is to bear sons, serve tea, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, fall in love with the flute teacher. Actual romantic love, the kind with stolen glances and passionate declarations, is mostly the territory of poets, traveling theatre troupes, and ghost stories. If you want to witness love in feudal Japan, you'll need to snag tickets to a no drama about two star-crossed lovers who become mist at sunrise. Go ahead, Try to step outside your assigned relationship structure. Adultery isn't just frowned upon. It can lead to exile, disgrace, or death by sword-related disapproval. And the punishment? That might come from your spouse, your lord, or your in-laws, whoever gets to you first. Even for samurai, taking a concubine is common, but it doesn't make life easier. It just means there are more people to disappoint silently. So yes, people did fall in love, secretly, painfully, often with the wrong person, and always at the worst possible time. Love wasn't forbidden in feudal Japan. It was just dangerously inconvenient. Every romantic impulse is a potential scandal. Every whispered promise a risk to your reputation, your family's standing, and, if things go truly sideways, your head. Now let's talk about the one companion you can't avoid, mortality. In feudal Japan, death isn't some distant, abstract concept. It's your neighbor, your co-worker, that one roommate who never pays rent, but is always hanging around. You don't plan for retirement, you plan for your exit. Death isn't a tragedy here. It's just another part of the script, one that everyone expects you to perform with dignity, grace, and maybe a little poetry. Start with the samurai. These warriors not only walk around with 2 swords, but also with a personal death plan. Lose a battle? Seppuku. Insult your honor at a feast? Seppuku. Spill sake on the daimyo's robe? Seppuku. Cue dramatic music? And don't expect any privacy. These are public spectacles, performed with the precision of a tea ceremony, but substantially more blood loss. It's not just a way to die. It's a way to redeem your name, and, if you're lucky, inspire a few verses in someone else's poetry journal. Don't think peasants have better odds. If you're a farmer and the rice harvest fails, you starve. If your village misses its tax quota, your head might be used as a very stern example. Drought, plague, bandit raid. Pick your favorite flavor of sudden demise. And don't count on medicine to save you. The best you can hope for is warm tea and herbal optimism. Let's talk about bandits for a second. They're not a distant threat. They're a daily reality. They're everywhere, and they absolutely do not care that you spent all year growing those daikon radishes. The roads outside towns are so dangerous, people simply don't travel unless it's absolutely necessary. When someone says, "Maybe we'll visit your cousin next year," what they really mean is, "I enjoy being alive." If you're a woman, childbirth is a dice roll. Complications. Too bad. Midwives do their best. But your surgical options are limited to boiling another towel and praying just a little harder. If your husband dies in disgrace, the expectation might be for you to follow him, not emotionally, but quite literally, with a dagger. And nature itself isn't helping. Earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, famine. Japan is a disaster artist. Your house could be swept away or buried at any moment, and your only insurance policy is a well-tied roof and a deep sense of spiritual acceptance. But here's the twist. You're expected to accept all of this with calm, wailing in terror, or fighting fate. That's undignified. A real hero bows before death, composes a poem, and meets the end as if it's just another awkward family dinner. So yes, feudal Japan is beautiful. A poem written in cherry blossoms and steel. But mortality is woven into the pattern, as ever-present as the mountain mist. And as you finish your day, nerves frayed by the endless social minefields, you might wonder if there's ever a break from all these rules. But don't get too comfortable, because next we're diving headfirst into the labyrinth of social structure, family duty, environmental chaos, and the joys of education in feudal Japan. In modern life, you're told to follow your dreams, be your own person, and live your truth. But here, well, let's just say the truth is whatever your lord says it is. Good luck. Imagine you wake up in feudal Japan, still clinging to the modern idea that you're supposed to find yourself. That's adorable. The only thing you're expected to find here is your designated place in the sprawling, suffocating web of your family's reputation. Individualism? That sounds suspicious. In this era, being your own person is just another way to say public disgrace. Your soul isn't a lone lantern in the dark. It's a single, brittle twig on a centuries-old family tree. Your job is to keep that tree from going up in flames, especially flames of shame, which spread faster than any wildfire and leave much deeper scars. You're not just a person. You're a living, breathing family heirloom, and your value is measured by how little embarrassment you bring to the clan. Every thought, every twitch, every accidental glance at the wrong person's daughter is a potential scandal. Your dreams are not your own. They're on loan from your ancestors. And if you try to swap them out for a new set, say, trading the family's proud tradition of horse farming for a career as a noodle chef, you'll be swiftly reminded that personal passion is a form of treason. Picture it, you, apron-clad, ready to make the best ramen this village has ever seen. Except your clan breeds horses, so congratulations. Your future is brushing manes, not boiling noodles. If you have a secret love of painting, your creative impulse will be repurposed to decorate the local temple, strictly according to someone else's vision, in total silence, and probably while kneeling. Express yourself too loudly, and you're not an artist. You're a liability. Family obligations aren't just a set of chores. They're a lifelong, ironclad contract. The samurai, those legendary warriors you've seen in movies, don't fight for personal glory. They fight to protect their house, their lord, and the memory of every ancestor who ever managed not to die in disgrace. If they do die, the manner of their demise had better be so honorable that it makes the entire family look good. Die awkwardly or shamefully, and your relatives will be gossip fodder for a generation. In some cases, your uncle might be expected to commit an act of self-mutilation just to erase the stain of your poor decision-making. No pressure. Your actions resonate up and down the bloodline. If your father once insulted the wrong official, you might still be paying the price, socially or even financially, decades later. Your cousin in the next province might find herself snubbed at a festival because of something your grandfather did. This isn't guilt by association. It's existence by association. You're not a standalone character in the story of history. You're a supporting actor in a never-ending family drama where the stakes are always sky-high. Let's say you crave a little rebellion. Maybe you want to write a poem with a bit too much edge, or you're caught flirting with the merchant's son at the rice market. Instantly, the consequences ripple outwards. Your siblings will be shunned. Your mother will weep into her sleeve. Your great-uncle, who hasn't spoken to you in years, will contemplate ritual self-disembowelment just to restore a shred of dignity. You are not just letting yourself down. You are detonating a shame grenade right in the middle of the family home. You're a representative, a chess piece, and, let's be honest, the most unpredictable liability on 2 feet. If, somehow, you manage to bow at the right times, marry the person the elders choose, and avoid any public disasters, your family might eventually say your name with something bordering on pride. Congratulations. This is the feudal Japanese equivalent of getting a gold star on your permanent record. But before you start celebrating, let's remember, surviving the social structure is only half the battle. Now, you have to survive the actual environment. Feudal Japan is a land of breathtaking beauty, but don't let the cherry blossoms fool you. Behind every postcard perfect scene lurks a natural disaster waiting to ruin your week. Let's start with the weather. Typhoons roll in like angry deities, flattening your rice fields and sending your carefully patched roof into the next village. The rain isn't just heavy, it's biblical. Roads vanish, rivers burst their banks, and the rice you spent months tending floats off to start a new life somewhere downstream. If you're lucky, the village headman will only double your taxes this year instead of tripling them. When the storms finally clear, you might think you're safe. That's hilarious. Earthquakes are next, and they arrive with zero warning. 1 minute, you're arranging flowers or polishing armor. The next, the world tilts, and your house is sideways. There's no emergency broadcast, just a sudden existential wobble and a lot of shouting. If you survive, you get to enjoy the bonus round, fires. Everything is wood. Your house, your furniture, your neighbor's house, and your best intentions. A single spark can take out half the village, and the only thing spreading faster than the flames is the news that you still owe taxes, even if your home is now a pile of ash. Floods will turn your streets into a muddy stew, and your animals may decide now is the perfect time to make a break for it. Your landlord doesn't care. He still wants his due, and if you're late, you tack on a little extra, just to keep things interesting. If you're holding out hope for a drought-free year, prepare to be disappointed. Weeks of relentless sun will crack the earth and shrivel your rice plants until the fields look like a failed baking experiment. You pray, perform rituals, and eye your neighbor's shrinking water supply with growing suspicion. And then, just when you think you've seen it all, winter arrives. Forget cozy fireplaces and woolen socks. Heating here is a group activity. Everyone crowds around a clay brazier, sharing the warmth and the hope that frostbite isn't the latest trend. The fire burns out by midnight, and if you're lucky, you'll only lose feeling in your toes. Had the occasional volcanic eruption, because Japan sits on the ring of fire and likes to remind you of it, and you've got a non-stop obstacle course of natural hazards. There's no disaster relief, no insurance. If your house collapses, you rebuild it. If your harvest fails, you go hungry. If your daimyo's estate is also destroyed, well, you still owe taxes. Only now you can pay in mud and tears. Nature in feudal Japan isn't just a scenic backdrop. It's an active participant in the ongoing game of how much can you endure before breaking. And while you're battling the elements, don't forget about the human-made hierarchy that controls every other aspect of your life. Power in Japan flows only one way, downhill, and so do the responsibilities, expectations, and, most importantly, the blame. You might think you're important, but there is always someone above you with a longer sword and a shorter fuse. Let's start from the bottom. If you're a peasant, your life is dictated by the village headman, who answers to a local samurai, who in turn answers to the daimyo, who bows to the shogun, who, on paper, answers to the emperor. The emperor, by the way, is less a ruler and more a beautifully dressed mascot, who occasionally blesses things and writes poems. Even the samurai, with all their swords and swagger, exist in a state of perpetual servitude. They're basically middle management with better uniforms. They serve their daimyo, follow orders, and sometimes get sent off to fight battles that have nothing to do with them. Their reward, if they're lucky, a little respect and a lifetime of stress-induced insomnia. The daimyo, those regional lords with their own armies and castles, might seem untouchable, right up until the shogun gets suspicious. Then it's surprise castle inspections, intercepted messages, and a sudden drop in life expectancy. Even the shogun, the supreme military leader, is constantly glancing over his shoulder, worried about ambitious underlings and family members with a taste for poison. He runs the country, but he probably doesn't sleep much. And then there's the emperor, who technically outranks everyone but has about as much real power as a decorative goldfish. He presides over rituals, names new eras, and tries not to look too bankrupt in public. The hierarchy is set in stone. You don't climb it. You're planted in it, like a carefully pruned bonsai. Ambition isn't a virtue. It's a warning sign. If you look like you're getting above your station, congratulations. You've just painted a target on your back. Respect always goes upward. Obedience flows downward. Orders are followed, not debated. Arguments are a luxury reserved for people with nothing left to lose. If you so much as hint at wanting more than your allotted share of power, you might as well start practicing your last words. Everyone is watching everyone else, hoping for a slip, a stumble, or a scandal. That's the real circle of life. And then, of course, there's education, if you can call it that. What you learn depends entirely on where you sit in this rigid social pyramid. At the top, samurai children get the royal treatment. From the moment they can walk, they're drilled in reading, writing, sword fighting, etiquette, poetry, archery, horseback riding, and the all-important art of looking unimpressed. By their teens, they're composing death poems and quoting ancient Chinese philosophers, while you were still trying to figure out how to sign your name without smudging it. Their education is intense, but it has a point. Produce loyal, competent servants of the clan who know exactly where and how low to bow. They study the classics, the rules of Bushido, and the subtle nuances of making every motion look like it was choreographed by the gods themselves. Drop down a rung, and you'll find the merchant and artisan families. Here, education is practical, not poetic. Math, bookkeeping, and just enough reading to avoid accidentally selling yourself into debt. Forget Confucian literature. You're learning how to tally turnips and haggle over the price of pickled radishes. It isn't glamorous, but it keeps the business running and the taxes paid. At the bottom, peasant children's education is as direct as it gets. This is a hoe. This is rice. Start working. The sun waits for no one. Your parents teach you how to plant, harvest, and survive. The only literacy required is recognizing the tax collector's silhouette from a safe distance. Actual schooling is a fantasy, right up there with 3 meals a day and dry shoes in the rainy season. If you see a scroll, it's probably a tax notice nailed to a tree, reminding you that your life is not your own. And then there's the question of girls. Unless you're born into a powerful family, formal education is mostly off the table. Instead, you're trained in the essential skills of domestic survival, sewing, etiquette, tea ceremonies, and the ancient art of staying silent while running an entire household. If you're extremely fortunate, you might learn calligraphy or a bit of poetry, as long as it never distracts you from folding laundry with the focus of a Zen master. Education in feudal Japan isn't about curiosity, creativity, or self-improvement. It's about fitting perfectly into your assigned role, with no questions asked. The idea of learning for pleasure would make any elder choke on their sake. Knowledge is tightly controlled, parceled out like rations, and always in service of the larger machine. So, to sum up, you're trapped in a social structure that's as flexible as a stone lantern, bound by family obligations heavier than your sword, menaced by an environment that seems personally offended by your existence, and locked into a hierarchy where ambition is a liability. Education, if you get any, is just another tool for enforcing obedience. Think you'd survive here? That's adorable. You wouldn't last a day. As you dust yourself off from this whirlwind tour of feudal expectations, brace yourself. Next, we're taking a sharp left turn, a journey from the ironclad rigidity of Japanese society to the wild, improbable saga of Artemisia of Caria. Feudal Japan is a land of breathtaking aesthetics. But wait until you see what happens when one extraordinary woman breaks every rule in the book. Picture yourself stepping into feudal Japan, ready to soak in all the beauty and grace you've seen in art books and those soothing, relaxing Japanese garden videos. You expect serenity, maybe birdsong, maybe a soft breeze carrying the scent of plum blossoms. But the first thing you notice isn't peace. It's the pressure. Every surface, every gesture, every breath feels like it's been audited by 1,000 years of ancestors, and they are not impressed. The aesthetic here is legendary, sure. Every detail, from the subtle arch of a bridge to the way a kimono sleeve falls, has been choreographed to perfection. But don't think for a second that this is about self-expression, or whatever you call that thing you do with latiform art. Here, culture is a kind of performance art, and the critics are everywhere. Everyone's watching, and everyone's judging. The stakes, a little higher than embarrassing yourself at karaoke night. Take the tea ceremony. Maybe you imagine it as a peaceful moment, a kind of spiritual time-out, where you can sip and meditate. In reality, it's a high-stakes social obstacle course, dressed up in silk and porcelain. The host has rehearsed every movement, and you, the guest, are expected to play your part with flawless precision. Sit in the right way. Accept the cup with the correct bow. Turn it twice, not once, and don't you dare slurp or sigh. Show humble gratitude, but not too much. Express serenity, but don't drift into sleep. Meanwhile, your brain is doing frantic calculations. Was that bow too shallow? Was that silence too long? Is everyone staring? Yes, they are. Get it wrong, and you're not just awkward. You're suddenly a cautionary tale. At best, people will whisper that your manners reflect badly on your upbringing. At worst, you'll be infamous as the one who ruined the mood. And in feudal Japan, ruining the mood is just a few degrees removed from dishonoring your ancestors. And if you're really unlucky, please write a poem before you disembowel yourself. You think calligraphy is just about pretty writing? That's adorable. Every brushstroke is a moral test. The ink, the paper, the angle of your wrist, all of it's supposed to reveal the state of your soul. If your kanji looks wobbly, don't expect anyone to politely overlook it. Your handwriting is basically a window into your emotional stability, your discipline, and whether or not you secretly harbor the heart of a barbarian. No pressure. Even poetry, the safe haven of sensitive types, comes with its own set of rules so dense you'd need a flowchart to keep up. You can't just jot down a haiku about your day. You need to write it in the right season, on the correct paper, using precisely the right metaphors. Too sentimental, and people will say you lack refinement. Too clever, and now you're showing off, which is somehow even worse. Step outside the lines, and you'll find yourself disinvited from that poetic moon viewing party. Everyone pretends not to care about, but secretly does. So yes, life in feudal Japan is beautiful, but it's a beauty edged with anxiety. You're not participating in culture to relax. You're there to prove to everyone, including yourself, that you belong. Every action is a test. Are you composed enough? Are you refined enough? Are you sufficiently terrified of appearing uncultured? If not, well, may the gods have mercy on your social standing. Or your bonsai. Let's not forget the endless hierarchy. If you're a samurai, congratulations. You get to carry the crushing weight of centuries of ancestral honor on your shoulders. And there's always the possibility that your next mistake will be your last. Before you get any ideas about just being yourself, know that individuality here is a dangerous luxury. If you're a peasant, you exist to work the land, your spine slowly curling under the weight of rice baskets and expectation. If you're a woman, your life is a long, careful exercise in grace, silence, and learning how to disappear around powerful men. And if you're anyone else, the system is custom built to keep you exactly where you are. This is a society engineered for obedience, not comfort. There are no days off from performing your identity. You're born into a role, handed a script, and expected to stick to it with the kind of discipline that could snap steel. Deviating isn't daring, it's dangerous. The individual means nothing. The clan, the lord, the land, they mean everything. Make a mistake, and the consequences range from icy social exile to the kind of ritual death that features in every weird history documentary. You wouldn't last a day, and not because you're weak or soft, but because the entire system is built to break anyone who stands out. Try to improvise, and watch as the entire order closes in to remind you that here, tradition always wins. Now, just when you've gotten comfortable with the idea that history is a long, unbroken parade of conformity, let's throw a wrench in the narrative. Enter Artemisia of Caria, a woman so out of place in her own time that she feels like a historical glitch, a bug in the code of ancient society. If feudal Japan is all about blending in and surviving through obedience, Artemisia is the living embodiment of, what if I just didn't? Imagine a world where, if you happen to be born a woman, your voice is supposed to be soft, your ambitions modest, and your greatest achievement is not causing trouble. Now, picture Artemisia. She's not just speaking in public, she's ruling, commanding, plotting, and, most shockingly, sailing her own warships into battle. Her very existence is a breach of protocol so dramatic, it makes stepping over a threshold with the wrong foot look like a minor wardrobe malfunction. Artemisia wasn't born into a world that wanted her to succeed. She ruled Halicarnassus, a city on the rugged southwest coast of what is now Turkey. Technically, she was a vassal of the Persian Empire, a minor queen in a patchwork of territories where loyalty was always up for negotiation. Most rulers inherited their crowns and then spent their days trying not to lose them. Artemisia inherited her throne from her husband after his death, but instead of stepping aside for a more suitable male candidate, she doubled down. She grabbed the reins, tightened her grip, and decided to make her rule dangerous. Her identity was a paradox in itself, Greek by blood, Persian by allegiance, and a woman who refused to stay in her lane. Her father was Carian, her mother from Crete. In an age where heritage meant everything and purity of bloodlines was a full-time obsession, she was already a political outlier. But Artemisia didn't seem to care. She played the game of power as if she'd invented it. When Xerxes, king of kings, began his campaign to conquer Greece around 480 BC, Artemisia did the unthinkable. She volunteered, not to stand on the shore and wish the men luck, but to command a fleet in the thick of battle. She contributed 5 of her own ships, fast and lethal, and led them into war herself. Not as a figurehead, not as a symbolic mascot, but as a genuine naval commander whose advice was actually heeded by the most powerful king in the world. Xerxes didn't just tolerate her, he listened to her. That in itself was a historic event. Her choice was more than bold, it was almost suicidal. She was a Greek fighting for Persia, a woman leading men who had spent their entire lives being told women were property, not peers. To the Greeks, she was a traitor, a queen-turned-mercenary, who'd sold her soul to a foreign empire. Imagine the gossip, a woman in command, fighting against her own people. The scandal practically wrote itself. Yet Artemisia didn't blink. She sailed into the campaign like she belonged at the high table of Persian power, and in many ways she did. Xerxes' court was a parade of generals and sycophants, men who made careers out of telling the king what he wanted to hear. Artemisia cut through their posturing with a kind of brutal honesty that was almost refreshing, if you weren't on the receiving end. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and unflinchingly realistic. She warned Xerxes not to force a naval battle at Salamis, knowing that the narrow straits would turn Persia's numerical advantage into a floating traffic jam. He ignored her, of course, because if there's anything history teaches us, it's that kings love ignoring good advice. Even among the Persians, Artemisia's presence was controversial. Many commanders resented her authority. She wasn't just a foreigner, she was a Greek woman, and she kept being right. She led her ships with unnerving precision, not as some ornamental queen, but as someone who was there to win. That unsettled more than a few battle-hardened warlords who had spent their careers carving up territory and shuffling pawns across the map. Back in Greece, Artemisia's reputation spread like wildfire. Historians like Herodotus, himself from Halicarnassus, seemed both fascinated and deeply unsettled by her. He wrote about her with a mix of awe and suspicion, usually reserved for legendary monsters. Think Medusa in a helmet, or a chess grandmaster who also happens to be a pirate. To some, she was a traitor. To others, a misunderstood genius. What everyone agreed on was that she was impossible to ignore. Artemisia was many things: a loyalist, a strategist, a traitor, a visionary. But above all, she was a master of survival in a world that didn't want her to survive. She understood that, in the chaos of war and politics, identity was a tool, not a cage. She bent the rules, broke them when she had to, and proved that sometimes the only way to win is to play a different game entirely. So, as you stagger out of feudal Japan, battered by rules and rituals you never understood, remember this: not every society demands quiet submission. Some, like Artemisia's world, reward the ones who refuse to fade into the background and punish them just as harshly. The line between brilliance and disaster is razor thin, and if you dare to walk it, you might just end up rewriting history. Or, more likely, you'll end up as a cautionary tale in some future boring history class about why sticking to the script is sometimes the only way to sleep soundly at night. But if you want to see what happens when someone ignores the script entirely, when a queen takes on an empire and bets her life on her own cunning, well, that story's just about to begin. If there was ever a stage that tested Artemisia's brilliance and boldness, it was the Battle of Salamis. If you think you'd survive in the ancient world by sheer force of personality or a few well-timed TED Talks, let me introduce you to the real queen of impossible odds, Artemisia of Caria. Picture this: narrow straits near Athens, the infamous Battle of Salamis, where half the world's historians still argue about who blinked first. And you, a clueless time traveler with zero naval experience, are about to get a front-row seat to the world's most catastrophic traffic jam at sea. Let's set the stage, because your modern brain is probably picturing clean lines, flags waving, and dramatic speeches. Not even close. The Persian fleet, bloated with the confidence of empire and sheer numbers, towers over the Greek navy like a sumo wrestler about to step on a mouse. But here's the catch, those Greeks. They know these waters the way you know your own Wi-Fi password. They're not here to play fair or lose politely. They're here to outmaneuver, outsmart, and outsurvive. Now, rewind a little. Xerxes, emperor of overconfidence and questionable decisions, calls his war council. Artemisia is there, the only woman in a room full of men convinced their beards are enough to guarantee success. She's the voice that cuts through the self-congratulation, warning, "Don't fight them here, not in the straits. You lose your advantage." She's not being coy, she's being tactical, reading the geography like a chess master, and seeing the disaster lurking behind every island. But Xerxes, high on the fumes of his own legend, ignores her. He wants spectacle, not strategy. He wants the kind of victory that makes the gods jealous. What he gets is a fiasco that will echo through history as a lesson in what happens when pride steamrolls prudence. The battle itself is chaos. Imagine 1,000 ships packed into a waterway, barely wide enough for a decent game of bumper boats. Oars snap, hulls crunch, and the shrieks of men drowning out any chance of orderly command. You, if you were there, would be clinging to the rail, praying not to fall in or get skewered by a poorly aimed javelin. In the midst of this churning disaster is Artemisia, steering her flagship with the kind of focus that would make modern fighter pilots jealous. All around her, allies and enemies blur together in a deadly soup of splintered wood and panic. And then comes the moment that still gives armchair admirals fits. A Greek ship locks onto her, relentless. She's being hunted, her escape routes evaporating with every second. Now, here's where most commanders freeze, or worse, call for help that will never come. Artemisia, instead, makes a move so audacious it feels like it was pulled straight from a spy novel. She orders her ship to ram. Yes, ram, another Persian vessel. Not a Greek ship, mind you, but one belonging to an allied king. The impact is brutal. The allied ship splinters, men scream, and in the confusion the Greeks hesitate. They see one of their own enemies attacking another, and suddenly doubt who's friend and who's foe. Artemisia slips through the chaos, untouched. The Greek captain, convinced she's on his side or simply too confused to pursue, breaks off the chase. Meanwhile, on a hilltop far from the carnage, Xerxes is watching through whatever passed for ancient binoculars. He sees her maneuver and, in a moment of dark comedic irony, turns to his attendants and declares, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." That's not exactly a motivational slogan you'll see on a coffee mug. But for Xerxes, it was a rare moment of admiration. For someone who'd just sacrificed a supposed ally to save her own skin and ship, you might call that ruthless. Artemisia called it Tuesday. But don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't just a desperate move for survival. This was calculated brilliance. Artemisia read the battlefield in real time, understood the psychology of her enemies, and used the fog of war as a shield. She bent the rules, rewrote them, and walked away when most would have gone down with their ship. Controversial? Absolutely. Effective? Unquestionably. The aftermath was ugly. The Persian fleet limped away, battered and broken, its myth of invincibility shattered on the rocks of Greek cunning. Morale was in ruins. Commanders whispered behind closed doors, and more than a few reputations drowned in those salty waters. But Artemisia, she returned not as a disgraced survivor, but as the sole commander who'd managed to outthink, outfight, and outlast the disaster. It didn't escape Xerxes' notice. Back on dry land, licking the wounds of a campaign gone sour, he faced a reckoning. For perhaps the first time he turned not to his chorus of yes men, but to Artemisia. This was no longer a novelty act. He needed real counsel, and she was the only one left who hadn't failed him spectacularly. Picture the scene. The Persian court, heavy with the stench of defeat and desperation. Xerxes, stripped of his former arrogance, asks Artemisia what to do next. This is the moment where most advisors would offer platitudes, suggest face-saving maneuvers, or simply defer to imperial ego. Artemisia is not most advisors. She tells him, plain and simple, retreat. Leave Greece. Go home. Let your general Mardonius handle the mess. Athens is ashes. You've made your point. Don't tempt fate any further. And the most shocking thing? Xerxes actually listens. The king who had dismissed every warning now follows the advice of a woman he once considered a side note. If you're keeping score, this is the part where you realize that the real power in the room was never about titles or gender. It was about knowing when to cut your losses. For her honesty and clarity, Artemisia is entrusted with the guardianship of Xerxes' sons. In the ancient world, that's the equivalent of handing someone your password, your keys, and your will. Only the most trusted, the most ironclad in loyalty and judgment, get that honor. She's gone from outsider on the imperial fringe to the very center of power. Back in Halicarnassus, she returns not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as a legend already in the making. Her reputation is no longer just that of a competent ruler. It's that of a woman who stared down the greatest empire of her day, survived a disaster of epic proportions, and came out the other side stronger. But here's where the weird history gets even weirder. Artemisia's feats weren't just whispered about in smoky war rooms or sung in taverns. They were recorded obsessively by Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who, by the way, grew up in Halicarnassus himself. You can almost imagine him as a boy, listening to stories of his queen, not realizing he'd one day become her scribe. There's a strange intimacy to his account, as if he's not just writing about a figure of legend, but about someone who shaped his own sense of what leadership really means. Herodotus refuses to flatten her into a stereotype. He doesn't call her a saint, nor does he cast her as a villain. Instead, he paints a portrait of someone razor-sharp, calculating, and far more competent than the men around her. He lingers on the details, the sinking of the Allied ship, the way she manipulated Greek confusion, the cold brilliance of her escape. In his hands, Artemisia becomes more than a name. She's a contradiction, a riddle wrapped in a warship. Respect was not handed to her. It was yanked from the jaws of men who had been taught that women belonged in the background. She didn't just survive in the shadow of Xerxes and Mardonius. She outshone them. While they were busy chasing glory, she was busy making sure she lived to see another day. It's a kind of wisdom rarely celebrated in the ancient world, especially when it comes from a woman. Maybe that's what fascinated Herodotus most of all. Artemisia didn't fit any of the neat little boxes carved out by tradition. She wasn't a rebel for rebellion's sake, but she didn't mind bending the rules when survival was on the line. She didn't have a manifesto, but her actions spoke volumes about the stupidity of equating femininity with fragility. In a world of rigid roles and unforgiving hierarchies, she was the exception that proved every rule was meant to be broken if you were clever enough. Her story spread not through marble statues or golden inscriptions, but through stories, half rumor, half reluctant admiration. Men who lost to her had to admit, however grudgingly, that she was simply better. In the war councils, she was the sharpest mind. In battle, she was the quickest to adapt. In the snake pit of politics, she was the last one standing. The men who thought themselves immortal needed scribes to keep their memory alive. Artemisia wrote herself into the bones of history, and the name didn't die with her. About a century later, another queen takes up the mantle, Artemisia II, likely a descendant, ruling Halicarnassus in her own right. She doesn't command fleets, but she does something equally monumental. She builds the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, for her husband Mausolus, who, in a twist of ancient dynastic awkwardness, is also her brother. Yes, ancient politics always find a way to make your family reunions look tame. But her mausoleum isn't just a monument to grief. It's a monument to memory, to political theatre, to the idea that one woman's name could echo through centuries. Because of her, we use the word mausoleum today, a linguistic fossil carved out of marble and ambition. Historians still bicker about whether the 2 Artemisiae were mother and daughter, aunt and niece, or simply 2 women united by name and audacity. The details are fuzzy, but what's clear is that the name Artemisia became armor for Halicarnassus. It was a title, a warning, and a legend all at once. Power, intellect, and the refusal to go quietly, these became the hallmarks of her legacy. So, why does it matter? Because in a world where the rules were stacked against her, Artemisia didn't just play the game. She invented her own. She stood toe-to-toe with empires and didn't blink. She crossed lines nobody else dared approach, let alone step over. She didn't just survive history's meat grinder. She came out the other side holding the blueprint for power in her hands. And if you think that kind of legacy fades, think again. The echoes of Artemisia's decisions ripple through time, shaping not just the fate of one city or one dynasty, but the way we remember women in power at all. Her story is messy, complicated, and refuses to be boxed in, which, let's face it, is probably why you're still hearing it now. But the thing about legacies is that they never settle. They twist and morph with every retelling, every new generation that tries to claim them. Artemisia's story, as you'll see, has always lived in the in-between. Between empires, between genders, between legend and history. And that's where we'll pick up next. If you think you've ever had an identity crisis, maybe you wore the wrong blazer to a job interview, or accidentally joined the wrong group chat, just wait until you try to pin down the legacy of Artemisia of Caria. Her story is the historical equivalent of standing at a crossroads with all the signs pointing in different directions, and none of them in your language. She's always existed in those murky spaces, between empires, expectations, and the blurry lines separating what actually happened from what people desperately wished had happened instead. And nowhere does this ambiguity get more interesting or more infuriating than in the way her reputation has been tossed around, reimagined, and occasionally mangled over the centuries. So let's get this out of the way. Who was Artemisia really? Was she a loyal servant of Persia, a calculating traitor to Greece, or just a sovereign queen playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else was still busy poking each other with pointy sticks? The answer depends entirely on who you ask, and they'll all swear they're right. If you step into the sandals of a Persian chronicler, Artemisia comes off as the gold standard of loyalty. She was one of the only commanders, male or female, who actually gave Xerxes advice worth listening to. Imagine being so competent that the king of kings, a man drowning in flattery and bravado from his generals, actually stops and listens to you. That's like being the only person in a corporate boardroom who dares to say, maybe don't invest the entire treasury in crypto. In the Persian world, her name came to stand for honor, composure, and the kind of practical intelligence that gets you noticed by people who could, at any moment, have you thrown off your own balcony. Now, swing over to the Greek side, and things get more complicated, and, let's be honest, a lot more entertaining. To hear some Greeks tell it, Artemisia was a traitor, a Greek by birth, now cozying up to the Persians and helping to conquer her homeland. If you're looking for a historical villain in a toga, you found her. But the Greeks couldn't help themselves. Even Herodotus, who practically invented the art of dramatic storytelling, had to admit she was clever and capable. She was like a living contradiction, as if the ancient world itself couldn't decide whether to boo or cheer. Not all Greeks stood with Greece. Not all Persians were cartoon villains, and Artemisia was proof that the world was a lot messier than the old epics liked to admit. Flash forward a couple thousand years, and we're still arguing about her. Is Artemisia a feminist icon before feminism had a name? Is she a symbol of cool-headed leadership in a time when the world was run by men with more ego than sense? Absolutely. And if you ask military historians, she's still making cameos in naval history books as one of the vanishingly rare women to command warships in the ancient world. In the land of strategy and politics, she's the voice of reason in an age of unchecked pride. And then there's pop culture, which can never resist a good story, no matter how much it has to stretch the truth to fit the costume. But here's the inconvenient reality. Artemisia didn't wake up in the morning thinking about how she'd be remembered by future generations, or if she'd get a dramatic close-up in some future Hollywood epic. She wasn't in it for the legacy. She was in it to survive, to rule, to win. She navigated a world where every wrong move could get you erased from history, or worse, rewritten into a cautionary tale for ambitious women. Her story endures not because she was obsessed with image, but because she made the kind of choices that echo through time, whether people like them or not. She didn't belong to Persia, and she didn't belong to Greece. The only person Artemisia truly belonged to was herself, and that's precisely what made her so dangerous and so unforgettable. As the centuries rolled on, Artemisia's story did what all the best histories do. It mutated, twisted, and took on a life of its own. She stopped being just a person and started becoming a legend, a metaphor, sometimes even a monster. Writers and dramatists picked her up and spun her into whatever shape suited the moment. Some made her into a seductive villainess, dripping with malice and mystery. Others recast her as a bloodthirsty warrior queen, barely human, driven by a hunger for violence. The real Artemisia, the strategist, the survivor, the woman who played a brutal game and lived to tell the tale, got buried beneath layers of fantasy, fear, and good old-fashioned misogyny. And why did this happen? The answer is almost laughably simple. Men, especially those in charge of the storytelling, didn't know what to do with a woman who gave orders, stood her ground, and told kings to their faces that they were wrong. She didn't fit the script. She couldn't be controlled. So, naturally, they rewrote her. One especially colorful legend insists that Artemisia, after falling head over heels for some guy who didn't return her affection, hurled herself off a cliff in despair. Because, of course, the only reasonable thing for a seasoned naval commander to do is to become the star of a tragic romance novel. The moment things get emotionally complicated, another version paints her as a scheming sorceress, more villain than leader, a queen whose power must have come from something unnatural. It's a pattern that repeats itself with clockwork regularity in history. When a woman dares to wield power with her mind or her will, later generations either soften her into a damsel in distress or darken her into a monster. Artemisia got both ends of that stick, neither of which, by the way, had much to do with who she actually was. The real Artemisia didn't rule by seducing or enchanting anyone. She ruled with vision, with cold calculation, and the sort of practical intelligence that makes everyone else wonder if they're playing the wrong game. She didn't just play by men's rules. She rewrote them as she went, and then dared everyone else to try to keep up. That's what unsettled all those who followed. Because if one woman could pull it off, what was to stop others from trying? Even today, the distortions keep coming. Hollywood can't resist a good femme fatale. So in 300, Rise of an Empire, Artemisia shows up as a vengeance-fueled supervillain, all black leather and slow-motion sword fights. Entertaining? Sure. Historically accurate? Not even close. But the fact that she still commands attention, inspires reinvention, and sparks debate proves that her legacy isn't just alive. It's practically radioactive. The woman they feared didn't disappear. She evolved. She's become a myth, a memory, and that same uncomfortable question that history refuses to let die. What if more women had been like Artemisia? When Artemisia finally vanished from the written record, she didn't vanish from history. Instead, she slipped into the undercurrent, like the wake left behind a warship slicing through dark water. No grand mausoleum marks her resting place. There isn't a single surviving statue of her. No marble likeness staring down through the ages. And yet, you can still feel her presence, etched into the bones of Halicarnassus, whispered in the yellowed pages of ancient chronicles, and endlessly debated by anyone trying to understand how she pulled off the impossible. Because that's exactly what her life was, impossible. She ruled when women weren't supposed to rule. She fought naval battles when women weren't even supposed to set foot on a deck, never mind command a fleet. She offered advice in war councils where women weren't supposed to utter a word. And somehow, despite every rule stacked against her, she was heard. She wasn't just tolerated, she was respected. That might be her rarest achievement of all. Not only did she survive as a woman in power, she earned the kind of grudging admiration that makes even enemies pause and reconsider. Centuries later, her name still sits as a paradox. She's not a household name like Cleopatra or Joan of Arc. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Artemisia didn't chase after legend, she chased results. There's no tragic romance, no mythic beauty, no melodramatic poetry draped over her story. Her drama happened behind closed doors, in the hush of the war room, in the cramped shadows of a ship, and in the long, measured silence of a king who actually listened. So what's left for you, standing here in the present, trying to figure out if Artemisia was a hero, a villain, or just someone who refused to play by the rules? Her story is an invitation. Scratch that, it's a dare. To look again, to see past the costumes and the clichés, and realize that sometimes courage doesn't look like swinging a sword or wearing a crown. Sometimes it's the person who sits at the edge of power, says the thing no one wants to hear, and then sails straight into the storm. Artemisia didn't need to be rescued, and she didn't need to be rewritten. The only thing she ever needed, the only thing she still deserves, is for people to remember her as she actually was, sharp, dangerous, and brilliant. In an empire stitched together by men, she charted her own course, steered through hostile waters, and defied gravity and tradition with every decision she made. As long as ships sail and historians love a good paradox, Artemisia of Caria will never truly vanish. So, as you try to sleep tonight, if you can sleep, after realizing just how much of history is shaped by fear, fiction, and a stubborn refusal to let women steer the ship, just remember, the night sky over Halicarnassus isn't empty. It's crowded with ghosts and questions. And Artemisia is right there among them, her story still rippling through time. And speaking of the night sky, let's turn our gaze even farther back, before there were telescopes, before Copernicus rearranged the universe. People looked up and tried to read the heavens with nothing but their eyes and cold stone. So, what did the earliest stargazers in Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt actually see? And how did those ancient observations shape the world you know today? Let's get something straight right out of the gate. You, with your smartphone weather app and atomic clocks, would not survive a single harvest in ancient Sumer, Babylon, or Egypt. Not a single one. You'd stand there, blinking at the sky, wondering why nobody just checks the forecast before planting barley. That's adorable. See, in these ancient worlds, the only notifications were celestial. Miss your star cue. And congratulations. Your entire village is about to experience a very real, very unfiltered version of starvation. Welcome to the original, unskippable survival game, the dawn of astronomy. Picture yourself on a dusty plain in Mesopotamia, around 3,000 years before anyone had invented the word history. There's no glass, no satellites, nothing but a horizon as wide as forever, and a night sky so dense with stars it almost aches to look at. You don't get to sleep in. You don't get a snooze button. You get the cosmos, and you'd better pay attention, because the sky isn't just scenery. It's the master schedule, the only calendar you'll ever get, and it's the difference between a good harvest and a slow, inglorious exit from the gene pool. Here's how it actually worked. You, or more likely some exhausted priest-mathematician with the social capital of a minor celebrity, would clamber up the nearest ziggurat, a towering step pyramid meant to bring you just a little bit closer to the gods, or at least above the mosquito line. These weren't just monuments for showing off. Each ziggurat was a proto-observatory, a platform for watching the stars and recording their patterns onto clay tablets with the same reverence you reserve for a new phone screen. Now, let's talk. Sumerians, true overachievers in the staring at the sky until your neck hurts department. Their genius wasn't in wild myth-making, though they certainly had enough gods to fill every celestial niche. No, the Sumerians looked up and saw rhythm, cycles, something that could be measured and used. They invented one of the earliest known calendars, built on the waxing and waning of the moon. Imperfect? Sure. But for organizing crops, festivals, and the occasional state-sanctioned human sacrifice, it was a huge leap forward. And if you've ever wondered why there are 60 seconds in a minute or 360 degrees in a circle, you can thank, or possibly curse, the Sumerians and their obsession with the number 60. Their base, 60 or sexagesimal system, still rules your clock and compass. So the next time you're late because you misread the time, just know you're participating in a 5,000-year-old tradition of poorly understood numerology. But let's not pretend there's anything easy about this. Imagine standing on a ziggurat, holding a clay tablet and a reed stylus, squinting at Venus as it flickers on the horizon. You'd have to record its rising and setting, note when the moon went blood red during an eclipse, and track star clusters as they disappeared for months and then re-emerged. These ancient skywatchers, the Omanu, combined the job descriptions of scientist, priest, and local weatherman. And make no mistake, if you got the timing wrong, you weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were risking famine, chaos, and the wrath of at least 3 pantheons. Now, don't get too comfortable. The Sumerians may have lit the spark, but it was the Babylonians who built the bonfire. Fast forward to about 1800 BCE, and you land in Babylon, where astronomy has picked up a new tool, math. Not the friendly calculator kind. We're talking about relentless, line-by-line records scrawled onto clay tablets with names like Enuma, Anu, Enlil, and Molapin. These weren't bedtime stories. They were raw, data-driven chronicles of the sky, planetary positions, eclipse cycles, and the kind of numbers that would make your high school algebra teacher weep with joy. And here's where things get really weird, in that special brand of weird history that never makes it into boring history classes. The Babylonians figured out the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat. Did they know why it worked? Absolutely not. Did they care? Not even a little. As long as the pattern held, they could predict eclipses and, naturally, interpret them as signs from the gods. Because in Babylon, being able to predict the next cosmic blackout wasn't just a party trick. It was power, political, spiritual, existential. If you wanted to keep your job as court astronomer, you'd better get your cycles right, or you'd discover firsthand just how quickly trusted advisor can turn into unemployed scapegoat. Let's not forget the zodiac. You know, that thing people still use to explain bad dating decisions. While the Greeks loved to take credit, the Babylonians actually beat them to it by centuries. They were the first to divide the sky into 12 equal parts, each anchored to a constellation. So, the next time someone asks your sign and you answer with a straight face, remember, you're quoting Babylonian astronomy, not some Instagram astrologer. The Babylonians didn't just assign names to the stars. They invented the very concept of cosmic personality tests. What really sets Babylonian astronomy apart is the way they treated the universe like a ledger. Everything was a pattern, a cycle, a number to be tracked and predicted. They weren't drawing pretty pictures. They were hunting for regularity amid the chaos. Their methods were strictly arithmetic, no geometric models, no philosophical arguments about the shape of the cosmos, just cold, hard numbers scribbled into clay. Practical, relentless, and shockingly accurate. In a world before telescopes and calculators, they calculated planetary retrograde motion and lunar eclipses with nothing but patience and the kind of focus you lose after 5 minutes without Wi-Fi. Meanwhile, let's pan over to Egypt, where the stakes were even higher. In the Nile Valley, astronomy wasn't an academic curiosity. It was the difference between life and death, order and disaster. Here, the sky was a divine clock, and the most important hand on that clock was a single star, Sirius. Each year, just before the Nile's annual flood, a flood that determined whether Egypt would feast or starve, Sirius made its dramatic reappearance on the horizon at dawn. Miss that cue, and you might as well start digging your own granary. The Egyptians, never ones for half measures, built an entire solar calendar around this event. 365 days, 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 bonus festival days for good measure. This was centuries before Julius Caesar got anywhere near a leap year. So much for Roman innovation. The Egyptians had already cracked the code. Their calendar was so close to ours, you could almost use it to check your next dentist appointment. But the Egyptians didn't stop there. Their temples weren't just places for chanting and incense. They were precision-engineered observatories. Take the great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, oriented so that the sun would rise directly through its axis on the summer solstice, or the Great Pyramid of Giza, aligned almost perfectly with the 4 cardinal points and possibly aimed at Orion and Sirius, just in case the pharaoh needed a celestial GPS for the afterlife. These structures weren't accidents of geometry. They were deliberate, data-driven acts of cosmic engineering. Imagine a world where your government building is also a scientific instrument. On second thought, don't. Modern zoning laws would never allow it. And in Egypt, the job of astronomer wasn't just a 9-to-5 gig. It was a sacred calling. Priests spent their nights tracking the stars, their days interpreting omens, and their afternoons making sure the pharaoh's birthday parties lined up with favorable celestial events. If you wanted to climb the social ladder, you had to know your way around a star chart. If you botched a prediction, it wasn't just embarrassing. It could get you exiled, or worse, made responsible for a bad flood year. The motif of ritualized consequences for minor mistakes. Alive and well in the Nile Delta. All of this, every clay tablet, every temple, every desperate gaze at the horizon, blended myth with measurement, faith with fact. The sky was both a clock and a scripture, a realm of gods and a field of numbers. These ancient astronomers weren't just gazing in awe. They were decoding a cosmic script, line by line, night after night, year after year. Their work shaped the rhythms of daily life, the power structures of their societies, and even the very bones of their cities. And the next time you're tempted to think of ancient science as primitive or quaint, Just remember, without a single lens or battery, these civilizations measured planetary cycles, aligned their monuments to solstices and stars, and created systems of timekeeping that echo through every clock, compass, and calendar you touch today. No sleep mode, no do-overs, just the relentless, unblinking sky. So, if you're ready to keep stumbling through history's cosmic obstacle course, pack up your clay tablet and reed stylus. We're heading across the globe, where a new set of stargazers is waiting in the jungles of Mesoamerica. Because if you thought Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt were obsessive about the heavens, you haven't seen anything yet. Long before Europeans set foot in the New World, the Maya were building one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems the world had ever seen. You land somewhere in the jungles of Mesoamerica, breathless and squinting into the haze, and you might think you've stumbled into a lost world of vines and ruins. Maybe you're picturing Indiana Jones, or at least hoping for a friendly monkey. But if you're expecting some kind of simple, primitive life, brace yourself. The Maya, centuries before Europeans could even get their bearings on the horizon, were building a civilization that could put your local science fair to shame. And here's the catch. They did it all without metal tools, no wheels, and certainly no telescopes. Their toolkit? Stone, sky, and more determination than you've ever shown trying to fix your Wi-Fi. For the Maya, astronomy wasn't just a dusty subject for elite scholars to debate over endless cups of ceremonial cacao. It was the backbone of absolutely everything. Rulers weren't just politicians. They were cosmic intermediaries. Picture your local mayor, but with the expectation that their every decision be synced to the exact position of Venus or the mood swings of the moon. Every major ritual, every war, every coronation, timed to celestial events with a level of precision that would make even NASA double-check their math. Take Venus, for example. The Maya didn't just notice that this bright star wandered the sky. They tracked its disappearance and reappearance in a cycle of exactly 584 days. And they didn't just jot this down on the back of a tortilla wrapper. No, they built this rhythm into their calendar, their rituals, and even their battle plans. You think office politics are complicated? Try fighting a war on a schedule set by a planet. Then there's the Dresden Codex, one of the rare Mayan manuscripts that survived the Spanish "let's set fire to your entire library" policy. Inside, you'll find the Venus table, a centuries-long logbook of that planet's every move, accurate to within a day. Let that sink in. They were better at tracking Venus with sticks and shadows than you are at remembering your own passwords. But the Maya weren't content with a single calendar. Why stop there? They ran three at once. The 260-day ritual calendar, the 365-day solar calendar, and the long count, which could date events thousands of years into the past and future. It's like running Windows, Mac, and Linux simultaneously without anything crashing. Their solar year clocked in at about 365.20 days, just a hair off our modern calculation. Not bad for people whose most advanced technology was a really well-shaped rock. And then there were the observatories. Forget glass domes and retractable roofs. The Maya built stone towers like El Caracol at Chichen Itza, perfectly aligned so priests could track the sun and Venus through cleverly placed windows. and the temples. Those were architectural calendars. At El Castillo, during spring and autumn equinoxes, a shadow slithers down the staircase, forming the shape of a giant serpent. The entire building becomes a cosmic clock, a public service announcement from the gods. Try getting your local city council to approve that kind of project. The Maya weren't just watching the sky. They were synchronizing their entire civilization to it. Kings ruled by the stars, temples rose in harmony with the solstices, wars were launched in step with planetary cycles. They wove the cosmos into their very existence, turning astronomy into a tool of legitimacy, power, and survival. If you're thinking you'd be able to keep up, take a number. Most modern folks can't even remember daylight saving time. Meanwhile, across the world in China, astronomy was less about personal enlightenment and more about national survival. Here, the emperor wasn't just in charge. He was the son of heaven, ruling with a mandate that could evaporate the moment the sky sent a bad omen. Astronomy wasn't tucked away in some dusty library. It was front and center, a matter of state security. Miss a solar eclipse? That wasn't just an awkward day at the office. It could mean the dynasty was about to topple. No pressure. Way back around 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were already cataloging celestial events with almost bureaucratic obsession. Comets, novas, eclipses, sunspots, planetary motions, they wrote it all down, sometimes with more detail than you put in your last group chat. These weren't idle observations either. The records that survived, like those in the records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han, are still used by modern scientists to double-check ancient cosmic events. Imagine your tweets getting cited by astrophysicists 2,000 years from now. That's the level of legacy we're talking about. And then there's the supernova of 1054. Chinese astronomers logged its appearance in the sky, noting its brightness and position so precisely that modern astronomers were able to dig up the Crab Nebula centuries later, right where the records said it would be. Meanwhile, Europe was still lighting candles and hoping for the best. But the Chinese didn't just rely on mystical readings of the night sky. They built actual machines, armillary spheres to model the heavens, water-powered celestial globes, and astronomical clocks that ticked off hours and planetary positions centuries before anyone in Europe thought to put gears together. They divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, a cosmic real estate system for navigation and timekeeping. And their lunisolar calendar? Still in use today for holidays like Lunar New Year. One of China's most important contributions was the meticulous recording and prediction of eclipses. If an eclipse happened and the emperor wasn't warned ahead of time, it was seen as a catastrophic failure for the astronomers, and possibly a sign that the emperor had lost his right to rule. So, no pressure if you're the new kid in the Imperial Observatory. You miss one eclipse, and suddenly everyone's looking at you like you just unplugged the national power grid. In China, astronomy wasn't an abstract pursuit. It was a tool for governance, legitimacy, and survival. The stars weren't just points of light. They were the ultimate fact-checkers, the celestial auditors who could make or break a dynasty. The empire didn't just watch the sky. It listened to it, and sometimes it quaked in fear at what it heard. Now, let's shift gears to ancient India, where astronomy was less about alarming the emperor and more about unraveling the deepest mysteries of existence. Here, the study of the heavens, Jyotisha, literally the science of light, wasn't a standalone subject. It was stitched into philosophy, ritual, math, and metaphysics. You didn't just study the sky to know when to plant your crops. You studied it to understand your soul. References to celestial phenomena show up as early as the Vedas, dating back around 1500 BCE. The texts mention the sun, moon, planets, and a sky divided into 27 nakshatras, or lunar mansions. These weren't just constellations. They were mythological waypoints and calculation anchors, forming the backbone of Indian astrology and calendars that are still used today. But if you think Indian astronomy was all incense and poetry, think again. Ancient Indian astronomers developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar. The Romans would boast about a millennium later. The Surya Siddhanta, compiled around 500 CE, describes the tilt of the Earth's axis, the elliptical paths of the planets, and even hints at gravity, long before Newton decided to sit under that fateful apple tree. Then there's Aryabhata, the mathematical prodigy who in 499 CE proposed that the Earth spins on its own axis once a day. This was at a time when most of the world still pictured Earth as an immovable plateau. Aryabhata also calculated the length of the year to within a fraction of modern values and invented advanced trigonometric functions to help with astronomical calculations. If you're struggling with high school math, just know he was doing calculus before algebra had an official fan club. Indian astronomers used decimal notation, shadow instruments, and spheres to measure angles and altitudes. Their observatories weren't just for show. They were aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions with painstaking accuracy. But beyond all the technical wizardry, Indian astronomy embraced a cosmic elegance. The universe was a cycle, a dance of time and space, unfolding endlessly. They weren't trying to conquer nature. They were searching for harmony, believing that by understanding the heavens, you could unlock truths about yourself. Planets didn't just move across the sky. They traced paths through your soul. Try explaining that at your next dinner party. If the Maya looked to the heavens for order, and the Chinese for political survival, and the Indians for cosmic meaning, then the Greeks, well, the Greeks looked up and asked, why? Why do the stars move? Why do the planets wander? And, most importantly, could the cosmos be explained by reason instead of myth? Greek astronomy was the great pivot point. They saw the same patterns, but they wanted explanations, not just rituals. It started with Thales of Miletus, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, celestial events had natural causes instead of being the result of gods with questionable motives. Then Anaximander came along and imagined the Earth floating in space, unsupported, surrounded by a cosmic sphere. Yes, that sounds basic now, but at the time, it was like claiming the world was round on flat Earth Twitter. The real leap came with Pythagoras, who saw the universe as a symphony, literally the music of the spheres, with math and ratios governing everything. His followers believed numbers could decode the cosmos, laying the foundation for theoretical astronomy. But it was Aristarchus of Samos, in the 3rd century BCE, who came closest to the truth we hold today. He proposed a heliocentric model, putting the sun at the universe's center. The world ignored him for nearly 2,000 years, turns out. Being right too early is just as bad as being wrong. Hipparchus, the father of observational astronomy, catalogued stars, ranked them by brightness, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and developed trigonometric tools to pin down celestial positions, all without a telescope. His accuracy is still impressive today. And then there's Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almagest became the textbook for over a millennium. He wove together Greek, Babylonian, and Egyptian know-how into a geocentric model that, while ultimately wrong, was so elegant and detailed that it survived until Copernicus finally gave it the old thanks, but no thanks. So, while the Greeks got plenty wrong, it was their relentless drive to explain, to argue, to model the cosmos with logic and math that truly changed the game. They showed the world that the stars weren't just random. They followed patterns your brain could, in theory, understand. Astronomy became a cosmic debate, a tension between myth and reason, between what you see and what you know. Now, before you get too comfortable gazing at the stars and congratulating yourself for all this ancient ingenuity, remember, none of these civilizations would have let you near their sacred calendars, royal observatories, or philosophical debates. You'd be the time-traveling intern who confuses Venus for a street lamp and gets exiled for mixing up ritual dates. And you wouldn't last a day. But let's not stop here. The story of how humans watched the skies only gets weirder and more consequential as we move forward. By the time the telescope was invented in the early 17th century, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the skies with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And soon, the fate of entire continents would be shaped not just by the stars, but by land deals and lines drawn on a map. Let's see what happens when ancient astronomy collides with the Louisiana Purchase and the march of history. Now, picture yourself blinking up at the sky, clutching your trusty smartphone, probably thinking you've got it all figured out. You can check the weather in Tokyo, track a satellite crossing the horizon, and even pull up a holographic map of Mars if you're feeling fancy. But let's strip away the apps, the telescopes, the endless notifications. Imagine you've been dropped into the dust and darkness of the ancient world, where your only tools are your eyes, some crude stones, and a gnawing sense that something up there controls everything down here. Welcome to ancient astronomy, where getting it wrong meant starving, offending the gods, or just building your temple slightly askew, which, for the record, would have been a social disaster on par with sending a typo-ridden royal decree. Now, before you start congratulating yourself for remembering Orion's belt from a planetarium field trip, let's get one thing straight. The ancients were the ultimate cosmic hackers. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia, the Maya in the steaming jungles of Mesoamerica, the Chinese and Indians gazing from their own river valleys, and the Greeks and Egyptians perched on the edge of the Mediterranean. They all stared at the same sky and came up with systems so precise that we still trip over their star names today. And the wildest part, none of them copied each other. No group chat, no shared Google Doc, just thousands of years of sleepless nights and raw, unfiltered curiosity. But why bother? Why did they spend centuries mapping constellations, tracking wandering planets, and predicting when the moon would rudely blot out the sun. It wasn't just for bragging rights at the next solstice festival. In those days, astronomy was the ultimate life hack. The sky told you when to plant your crops, when to haul your offerings to the temple, and, if you were ambitious, when to crown yourself king. Step out of line, and you'd risk famine, divine wrath, or worse, being the punchline of every priest's sermon for generations. And let's not pretend these sky watchers were all gentle sages in flowing robes. Sometimes, astronomy was a brutal, high-stakes game. Missed the right omen, and your head could roll, sometimes literally. Still, across continents and centuries, one thing kept showing up: a deep, almost religious respect for whatever grand machinery was ticking away above their heads. To them, the heavens weren't a passive backdrop. The sky was alive, intentional, sacred. A cosmic scoreboard where every flicker and alignment carried meaning. So, you're thinking, sure, ancient people liked the stars. What's that got to do with me? Well, next time you check your calendar, set an alarm for daylight saving time, or get lost trying to follow a GPS route, remember, you're living in the shadow of their obsessions. That Gregorian calendar, it's just the latest version of a project that started with people scratching lines in clay and wondering why the sun didn't rise in the same spot every morning. Every satellite orbit, every rocket launch, every wild-eyed astrophysicist muttering about dark energy, they're all walking in the footprints of those ancient astronomers who had nothing but time and relentless questions. The telescope, when it finally crashed the party in the early 1600s, changed the game completely. Suddenly, moons popped up around Jupiter. Venus started showing off its phases, and the sun itself revealed spots, like a cosmic teenager with acne. But don't give all the credit to Galileo and his lens-polishing friends. Their work was built on a foundation of neatly aligned stones, battered star charts, and the stubborn refusal to accept that mystery meant ignorance. It was the ancients who first decided that the universe runs on rules, not chaos, and that those rules could be, at least partially, decoded. So, next time you're lying awake, staring at the ceiling and counting sheep, or maybe even satellites, remember that you're part of a tradition that stretches all the way back to the dawn of civilization. The questions you ask about your place in the universe, the way you measure time, even the way you navigate through a city, all of it is tangled up in a legacy written in the stars by people who didn't have the luxury of sleep apps or fall asleep fast. Playlists. They became the first scientists, quietly scribbling their questions into the night, and in doing so, they gave us the tools to look deeper, not just into the blackness of space, but into our own tangled origins. But if you're hoping for a happy ending, with humanity gazing up in unison and singing cosmic kumbaya, you clearly haven't been paying attention. Because just as the ancients were perfecting their celestial calculations, history was gearing up to throw a planetary curveball. It's 1803, and you, freshly arrived in the modern world, are about to witness a deal so wild, historians still argue about whether it was genius, luck, or just a colossal accident. Get ready for the Louisiana Purchase, the real estate deal that makes every Black Friday sale look like amateur hour. Picture the United States, a scrappy adolescent republic, barely 30 years old, always a little unsure if it's going to make it through puberty. The Mississippi River is its lifeline. The port of New Orleans is the jugular vein. Farmers in the Ohio Valley are hauling their goods downriver, praying that some foreign power doesn't slam the door and send their fortunes tumbling into oblivion. President Thomas Jefferson, a man who can quote Cicero in his sleep and is allergic to government overreach, has one simple goal: secure access to New Orleans. That's it. He sends his diplomats, wallets bulging with up to 10 million, to sweet-talk the French into parting with a port and a few scraps of nearby land. But here's where the universe, in all its cosmic irony, decides to stir the pot. Instead of the expected haggling, the American diplomats find themselves staring across the table at a French offer, so audacious it might as well have come with a free set of steak knives. The entire Louisiana Territory, 828,000 square miles, stretching from the Mississippi to the Rockies, for the low, low price of 15 million. That's about 4 cents an acre, in case you're keeping score at home. Why did France pull this move? Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, emperor, war machine, and a man with headaches more numerous than his titles. Napoleon once dreamed of a North American empire, using Louisiana as a breadbasket to feed his Caribbean colonies, especially the sugar-rich jewel of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. But then the Haitian Revolution erupted. Enslaved people, led by the likes of Toussaint Louverture, torched the colonial playbook and sent tens of thousands of French troops to their graves, not only by sword, but by yellow fever. With Haiti slipping away and British war clouds gathering, Louisiana turned from asset to liability faster than you can say continental breakfast. Napoleon needed cash for his next war, not endless prairies he couldn't defend. So, in a move that would make any modern CEO weep with envy, Napoleon flipped his American ambitions on their head. Selling Louisiana, he figured, would do more than pay the bills. It would create a muscular new rival to keep Britain busy across the Atlantic. In his own words, "I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride." For Napoleon, this was chess, not checkers. He wasn't surrendering, he was rearranging the board. Back in America, Jefferson should have been celebrating. This was his dream come true. A nation of independent farmers spreading west, each with his own patch of land and a copy of the Constitution tucked under his arm. But history, as it loves to do, had a little joke in store, because the Constitution, the sacred blueprint Jefferson revered, had precisely zero to say about buying land from foreign powers. No clause, no footnote, not even a helpful doodle in the margins. Jefferson, the self-declared strict constructionist, suddenly found himself in a constitutional pickle. He even flirted with the idea of amending the document, but the clock was ticking, and Napoleon was not exactly the patient type. So here's where Jefferson's philosophical purity meets the brick wall of realpolitik. He does what he'd spent years criticizing his old rival Alexander Hamilton for. He embraces implied powers, arguing the purchase was justified as a treaty, something the Constitution did allow, as long as the Senate played along. And play along they did. In October 1803, the Senate ratified the deal with gusto, and Jefferson, squirming but resolute, declared it essential for the young republic's survival. You might think this would be the end of the story. A neat, inspiring tale of expansion and destiny. But you know better by now. Because the land wasn't empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations, each with their own histories, alliances, and hard-won territories. The newspapers called it a triumph, a blank canvas for American dreams. What they ignored was the simple, inconvenient truth. The ink on the treaty in Paris would soak through to every corner of the continent, reshaping lives, shattering sovereignties, and setting off conflicts that still echo today. So, as you stand with one foot in the ancient past and the other on the threshold of American expansion, remember, every grand leap forward comes with a shadow. The heavens may have guided the ancients, but down here on earth, history is written in deals, betrayals, and the relentless push for more. And just like that, the Louisiana Purchase was signed, sealed, and ratified. But what came next would be messier, more brutal, and far more complicated than any simple land deal. In the next chapter, we'll untangle the legacy of this seismic event, the explosive growth of the United States, the unraveling of indigenous nations, the deepening of slavery, and the transformation of the land itself. Buckle up, you're not out of the woods yet. You might picture the Louisiana Purchase as a tidy real estate deal, some handshakes, a couple of signatures, and suddenly the United States doubles in size. But here's what you never hear in boring history class. Nobody actually knew what they'd just bought. Not the president, not Congress, and certainly not the ambitious settlers polishing their muskets, ready to chase their manifest destiny all the way to the Pacific. What Jefferson snagged from Napoleon was less a deal and more a wild, unwrapped mystery box. Congratulations! You now own millions of acres of unmapped, ungoverned, and, incidentally, already inhabited territory. Good luck figuring out what comes next. Cue the grand American tradition. Send in an expedition and hope for the best. Enter Lewis and Clark, the original core of discovery, and their motley crew of river-hardened men, all setting out in 1804 from St. Louis with a mandate that was somehow both vague and impossibly ambitious. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, map the land, make friends with whoever lives there, find the fabled Northwest Passage, and, if you have time, maybe catalogue a few new plants and animals. Oh, and do it all with the clock ticking, because the land grabbers back east are already lining up. Let's not forget the Northwest Passage, that legendary shortcut to the Pacific. Jefferson's dream was one of those ideas that sounds great in a smoky cabinet meeting, but less so when you're knee-deep in mud, swatting mosquitoes the size of sparrows, and realizing every river seems to flow the wrong way. Spoiler alert, it didn't exist. But the search for it would redraw the map of American ambition and, just as importantly, give white Americans a reason to believe they belonged anywhere west of the Mississippi. The journey itself was a blend of hardship, discovery, and, if you're in the mood, a little bit of luck. Starting from St. Louis, Lewis, Clark, and their team paddled, marched, and occasionally stumbled their way across more than 8,000 miles of wild country. There were scientists when the mood struck, collecting over 100 new animal species and 180 plants, mapping rivers and mountains, and documenting everything with the kind of meticulous detail that would make your over-organized aunt proud. Their journals became a strange hybrid of scientific treatise, adventure diary, and ethnographic snapshot. In other words, they were writing the first American travel blog, minus the Instagram filters. If you're picturing Lewis and Clark as lone wolf heroes, stop right there. One of the most critical members of the expedition wasn't an American officer at all, but Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman, a new mother, and the group's indispensable translator, diplomat, and survival expert. Her presence, along with her infant son, was the ultimate nonverbal message to every indigenous nation they encountered. Don't shoot, we come in peace. She knew the terrain, the languages, and the intricate social codes that could mean the difference between a friendly trade and a deadly misunderstanding. Put simply, without Sacagawea, the core of discovery might have become the core of disappearing mysteriously. After reaching the Pacific and enduring a winter that would test anyone's patience, the expedition returned in 1806 with more than just tales of adventure. They brought back hard data, maps, scientific observations, new knowledge of waterways, plants, animals, and, crucially, the people who lived there. For the politicians and speculators, these findings were like a green light at the world's wildest intersection. The land wasn't just empty space on a map anymore. It was opportunity, ripe for the taking, or so they believed. But here's where the triumphal music abruptly fades. You're probably waiting for the part where all this discovery leads to peace, prosperity, and a parade down Main Street. Sorry to disappoint. If you're indigenous, the Louisiana Purchase wasn't a bargain. It was a declaration of trespass. The land that Jefferson bought from France was, in reality, already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations. Each one had its own language, laws, and boundaries, none of which were recognized by the new American landlords. From the Oglala Sioux to the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Mandan, these nations had been shaping the land, forging alliances and trading for centuries before any European thought to plant a flag and call it theirs. But in the minds of Jefferson and generations of American leaders after him, the Louisiana Territory was just a blank canvas, waiting to be painted over with farms, towns, and, of course, new American dreams. The native nations whose worlds stretched across these plains and rivers, they weren't consulted. They weren't warned. No one sent a polite letter or even a passive-aggressive memo. One day, they were sovereign peoples. The next, their land had been sold out from under them by distant strangers. Jefferson's vision for indigenous peoples was clear enough in his private letters. Assimilate if you can, move west if you must, or face the consequences. It wasn't yet called removal, but the threat lingered in every new treaty and every fresh wave of settlers. And those treaties, let's talk about them. The federal government began churning them out faster than you can say legal loophole. Some were negotiated with a veneer of fairness. Most were coercive or outright deceptive, and all had the same goal: push indigenous nations farther west, open up the land for American use, and, if necessary, back it up with military force. Disease, displacement, and broken promises did the rest. What followed wasn't just expansion, it was erasure. The Louisiana Purchase was the legal foundation for an idea that would come to define the American mindset: manifest destiny. The notion that the United States was destined to stretch from coast to coast, no matter who stood in the way. The price? The lives, lands, and cultures of the people who'd been there for generations. For indigenous communities, this wasn't a transaction. It was an act of violence, a redrawing of maps they'd never agreed to, and the opening salvo of a conquest that would echo for centuries. To many American politicians and settlers, the purchase was a bloodless victory, a paperwork miracle that nearly doubled the nation's territory. But on the ground, things got messy fast. Expansion didn't come with a tidy bow. It came with blood, conflict, and the slow grinding destruction of entire ways of life. The land's true cost wasn't gold. It was paid in sorrow. Broken families, and cultures pushed to the margins. As soon as the ink dried on the treaty, settlers surged west, drawn by dreams of fertile soil, cheap land, and a shot at personal freedom. The government was never far behind, establishing forts, roads, and offices to keep the new empire running smoothly. What followed was the slow-motion collision of two worldviews, one that saw the land as private property to be fenced and farmed, the other that saw it as a living communal entity, governed by tradition and respect. Predictably, conflict erupted. Skirmishes soon turned into outright wars. Treaties were signed, then broken, with a speed and regularity that would make any lawyer's head spin. The so-called frontier line didn't stand still for long. It moved relentlessly west, driven by rifles, railroads, and an insatiable hunger for land. Along the way, the United States left a trail of broken promises and displaced nations, with each new settlement marking another chapter of loss for indigenous peoples. But the devastation wasn't limited to native nations. The Louisiana Territory also poured gasoline on another slow-burning crisis: slavery. Southern leaders, ever the opportunists, saw acres of new land as the perfect stage for their plantation economy. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern reaches of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as the key to unlocking that wealth. This sparked a question that would haunt Congress for decades: would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The answer would tear the country apart. The Missouri Compromise was Congress's desperate attempt at a solution. Draw an invisible line across the territory, slavery below, none above. Simple? Not in the slightest. That imaginary line became a political fault line, with every new state threatening to tip the balance and plunge the nation into chaos. The question of slavery in the New West laid the groundwork for the Civil War, stretching the American political fabric until it was ready to snap. Let's not pretend the environment got off easy either. The rivers were dammed, the prairies plowed, and the buffalo, once numbering in the millions, were nearly obliterated. The transformation was swift and, for many native species and cultures, irreversible. Where fire, herds, and indigenous stewardship had shaped the land for centuries, the new regime brought fences, monoculture, and extraction. The open world of indigenous America was chopped into rectangles, each one measured, fenced, bought, and sold. As the United States claimed the land, it also inherited a new kind of burden, a legacy of dispossession, conflict, and unresolved debts that still echoes in debates over land rights, tribal sovereignty, and reparations. Sure, the land was purchased, but the real cost? Still coming due. Generation after generation. Once the deal of the century was inked, the federal government faced a new headache. How do you govern a land that's bigger than your wildest dreams, but with no roads, no towns, and more competing claims than a modern comment section? The territory stretched across what would become 15 states, from Louisiana to Montana, Dakotas to Colorado. In 1803, it was a vast, undefined wilderness, full of possibility, but even fuller of complications. The first step was to draw lines. Surveyors, mapmakers, and military engineers fanned out, transforming rivers and mountains into borders, then counties, reservations, and eventually states. Expeditions like Lewis and Clark's were only the beginning. Soon, every unclaimed patch of land was subject to debate, speculation, and, eventually, a tidy rectangle on somebody's map. Congress moved fast, organizing the territory into military districts, then formal territories, each with a federally appointed governor. The Northwest Ordinance set the pattern. Once a territory had enough settlers, it could apply for statehood. But don't kid yourself. Those borders weren't always logical or just. Missouri's creation in 1821 is a case in point. It was the first state carved from the purchase, and its request to allow slavery set off a nationwide political firestorm. The Missouri Compromise's imaginary dividing line would haunt politics for decades, as every new territory threatened to upset the delicate balance between North and South. Meanwhile, white settlers weren't waiting for the ink to dry. They squatted, preempted, and grabbed land however they could, sometimes with the government's blessing, more often without it. Native peoples, even those with treaties in hand, found their homelands reclassified overnight, first as territory, then as open land, and finally as someone else's farm. The new maps didn't just add information. They erased it, wiping away indigenous trails, seasonal migrations, and place names, replacing them with Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, and Fort Pierre. It was a cartographic disappearing act, performed at the expense of entire cultures. In the new American vision, borders were more than just lines. They were instruments of control, tools to claim, divide, and govern land that, just a few years earlier, belonged to no president, no state, and certainly no empire. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a land deal. It was the blueprint for a new kind of domination, one that redefined what it meant to be American and who got to make those decisions. So, if you think you'd have thrived in this era, staking your claim, building your farm, living off the fat of the land, think again. You wouldn't last a day. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and you'd find yourself on the wrong side of a treaty, a border, or a musket barrel. The promise of new beginnings came with a price, and for most, it was a bill they never saw coming. But the story doesn't end here. The real legacy of the Louisiana Purchase is how it transformed the very idea of America, its ambitions, its contradictions, and the lives it shaped and shattered along the way. And in the next chapter, we'll see how those contradictions became the bedrock of American identity itself, as the boundaries of the nation and its conscience continued to shift. You thought the Louisiana Purchase was just some boring history footnote, a tidy real estate deal where Thomas Jefferson scribbled his name, and voila, America doubled in size. That's adorable. Let me walk you through the real impact, because if you're about to time travel back to 1803, you're not just stepping into a bigger country, you're tumbling straight into a national identity crisis with a side of moral whiplash. This isn't a simple story of maps and treaties. It's the moment the United States took its first wild leap from scrappy coastal upstart to an empire. In training, clawing its way across a continent it pretended was empty. Picture the scene. 1 minute you're part of a young republic nervously clutching the Atlantic shoreline, hoping the British don't come back for round 2. The next, thanks to a deal in Paris, you're suddenly responsible for lands so vast and so unknown that even seasoned explorers blinked in disbelief. Welcome to the age of manifest destiny, before anyone even coined the term, a time when ambition outpaced maps and optimism ignored consequences. Politically, the purchase did more than redraw borders. It cracked open the Constitution like a walnut, setting a precedent the founders never quite imagined. The president bought a continent without asking Congress for instructions, and everyone just shrugged and decided, sure, let's do this again. Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, America's collection of real estate deals reads like a shopping spree with no return policy. The federal government learned that if you wave a treaty in the air, you can grab whatever you want, and people will call it progress. Now, let's talk about the story America loves to tell itself. The Louisiana Territory became a blank canvas for the myth of the frontier. Rugged settlers, fearless explorers, endless possibility. Cue the stirring music, the wagon wheels, the sepia-toned daydreams. But look a little closer, and you'll see that every pioneer's dream was someone else's nightmare. For native nations, this wasn't a story of opportunity. It was the opening chapter of a long, brutal eviction notice. Land lost, treaties shredded, cultures bulldozed, sometimes literally. Economically, the impact was dizzying. The Mississippi River, once a meandering landmark, became the pounding heart of American commerce. Riverboats packed with cotton, wheat, and, yes, enslaved people churned up and down its length. Cities like St. Louis and New Orleans exploded into vital, chaotic trading posts, pulsing with gold rushes, speculation, and the kind of feverish energy that makes modern startup culture look sedate. The prairies, once the domain of buffalo and sacred ground, rolled under steel plows and sprouted fields of wheat. Silver, gold, and oil, America's new lifeblood, waited underground, fueling the next century of industrial ambition. But here's where the contradictions start to pile up like overdue bills. The Louisiana Purchase is American ideals and American failures, locked in a wrestling match that never quite ends. Freedom and growth, yes, but also slavery, dispossession, and the relentless logic of conquest. You don't get the land of opportunity without someone else paying the price. And those receipts are written in lost languages and broken treaties. Look around today and you'll see the aftershocks everywhere. The patchwork of states that came from the purchase now holds millions of people, highways slicing through what were once wild grasslands and sacred sites. Wheat fields ripple where buffalo herds thundered, and strip malls now stand on ground that once held centuries of memory. If you listen closely, or maybe just dig beneath the asphalt, you'll feel that uneasy legacy pulsing beneath your feet. The purchase wasn't just a transaction. It was a turning point that rewired the DNA of the United States. So, was the cost just a pile of gold coins handed over in Paris? That's the history textbook version. In reality, the price was measured in lives uprooted, cultures erased, and landscapes forever transformed. The United States grew, yes, but it grew by swallowing whole nations and rewriting stories that can never be given back. The ink dried in a foreign city, but the consequences echo across the American interior to this day. The purchase gave America a new kind of confidence, a swagger that said, expansion wasn't just possible, it was destiny. That belief hardened into policy, then into manifest destiny, and eventually into the relentless march to the Pacific and beyond. The West stopped being a mystery and became a target. If something existed, it could be claimed, fenced, and sold. For the government, it was a model of power: seize, settle, develop, repeat. For settlers and speculators, it was an invitation: move fast, break things, and hope the rules catch up later. But for native peoples, the transformation was catastrophic. Their homes, trade routes, and sacred spaces were suddenly stamped property of the United States. No discussion, no consent. Treaties arrived and evaporated. Reservations were boundaries drawn by strangers. Bison vanished, languages faded, and centuries of tradition were squeezed into ever-shrinking corners. By the time the dust settled, the original inhabitants of the Louisiana Territory found themselves silenced, but never completely erased. Even now, the legacy of that purchase is layered, a strange blend of thriving cities, roaring economies, and infrastructure built on unsettled ghosts. The rivers became arteries for growth, the land became a stage for reinvention, and the haunted memory of what was lost refuses to fade. So here you stand, a product of the Louisiana Purchase's contradictions. It's a tale of ambition and amnesia, a victory parade marching past invisible graves. The United States would not be what it is, sprawling, restless, innovative, without that audacious deal. But that same deal left behind a reckoning we still haven't finished. How do you celebrate a land you never truly asked for and can never truly return? That's a question history keeps asking, and one you'll still be answering long after you've woken up from this weird history dream. Good luck surviving it.